I gave up everything. She took everything. For the past 2 years, I've been sitting with that sentence like a rock I can't put down. It doesn't get any lighter. It doesn't make any sense. It just sits in my chest, smooth and cool and permanent. But to understand what Diane did, you first have to understand what I left behind. In 2019, I was 34, and my life was exactly where I had been building it for a decade. I had a corner office at Harlow & Peck, one of the mid-sized architecture firms in Columbus, and I was 18 months away from becoming an associate. I had a drafting table covered in blueprints for a mixed-use development in the short north. I had a one-bedroom apartment with good light and a coffee shop on the corner where the barista knew my order in advance. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, little by little, consciously chosen, the way hard work chooses things. Then in March, Dad had his first stroke. The phone rang at 6:47 a.m. I remember because I was already up, drinking my second cup of tea and reading the comments on the short north plans. Mom's voice on the other end of the phone was strange, very quiet, as if she were afraid to say the words she was saying. "Maya, he's in the hospital. They say he's serious." I drove to Bexley that morning, and to be honest, I never came back. Dad's stroke had left him with weakness on the left side of his body and slurred speech, which was so frustrating that he would never admit it. He had physiotherapy 3 times a week. He needed someone to drive him. Mom was 68 and quietly dealing with her blood pressure issues the way she dealt with everything, secretly, so as not to worry anyone. One afternoon, I found her medication organizer, with 7 separate vials for each day, and I counted 4 different medications she had never mentioned. By June, I was working remotely from my childhood bedroom. By September, my manager called me on a video call and used the word power. By the end of the year, I agreed to a vacation that we both understood was not really a vacation. In January 2020, I moved home for good. I packed my drafting table into a storage unit off Morse Road, where it sat for the next 3 years. A thin layer of dust accumulated on its blueprints, which eventually became meaningless because the project was built without me. Diane knew all this. She was living in Chicago at the time and working as a paralegal at a firm that did estate law, which later became relevant in a way that still turns my stomach. She would call on my birthday. She came home for Christmas 2020 and stayed for only 6 days, which seemed generous to her but insufficient to me, though I never said it. We had an understanding, like some siblings have unspoken, carrying each other's burdens. Maya handled things directly. Diane handled things from a distance. It seemed like the arrangement was working. What I didn't see, what I didn't have the strength to see, was how carefully Diane was watching. Not out of concern, not out of love. She was watching in the way that one watches to win a game when one can sense the right moment to play. I was changing my dad's catheter bag, taking my mom to her oncology appointment, and sleeping for 4 hours straight in a twin bed surrounded by 7th grade swimming trophies. I wasn't watching anything. That was my mistake. Dad died in March 2022 of pneumonia before Parkinson's nearly killed him. Mom lived for another 14 months, which may sound like a relief, until you realize what those 14 months were like: hospice shifts, medication schedules, and nights when she called people who were no longer there or hadn't yet arrived. I spent most of those months holding her hand. I was the one who called the funeral home twice. Diane came to Dad's funeral and stayed for 4 days. She cried beautifully at the graveside, the kind of crying that looks so good in pictures, and then she sat in the living room with Mom holding her hand and saying the right things. Mom brightened up for her. That was the part that used to piss me off, but I've come to terms with it now. Sick people seek out the bright. Diane was bright, I was functional. Those are 2 different things. What I didn't know was that sometime between Dad's funeral and the spring of 2023, Diane had started calling Mom on her own. Not the usual follow-up calls they always made. Real calls. Long calls. I would hear Diane laughing at something she said as I passed Mom's house, and a complex tangle of relief and pain would come over me that I didn't examine too deeply, because I wasn't in that frame of mind. I also didn't know that Diane had hired a lawyer. Not the family estate attorney, not Harlan Briggs, who had drawn up my parents' will in 2004 and handled the paperwork for my dad's once necessary small business. Someone else. A solo lawyer named Jeffrey Alt, who had an office in Worthington, 12 minutes from this house. I knew his name now. I had spent a lot of time with his name. Mom died on a Tuesday in June. Silently, just as the hospice nurse said, some people go from one breath to the next while I am downstairs making oatmeal that I wouldn't eat. By August, Harlan Briggs had set the date for the reading of the will. I drove to his office in the same blazer I'd worn to both funerals. I was in a kind of fatigue that no longer felt like fatigue but more like the weather, a permanent mood in my life. Harlan set a folder on the table, opened it, and said first that it was a codicil. An amendment to the will, signed and notarized 7 weeks before Mom died. I remember thinking the words sounded out of place in the room, too formal, like it was from another century. He explained what it said. He kept his voice natural, just as professionals do when they say something they know will be poorly received. The codicil named Diane as the sole beneficiary of the estate. Not primary, not a majority. Sole. I asked Harlan to repeat that. He did. I sat there in my funeral blazer, staring at the notary's seal on the document, trying to find some form of reality where this made sense. The house, the savings, everything my parents had built, held on to, and left behind after 61 years of marriage, everything reoriented, everything is over. I called Diane from the parking lot. She let the call go to voicemail. I stood next to my car in the August heat, staring at the concrete, and realized with a clarity that seemed almost physical that the unwritten understanding I had come to believe in, that had structured my entire adult life for 4 years, had never really been an understanding at all. It was a blind spot, and someone was standing just beyond its edge, waiting patiently. The weeks that followed that parking lot are still a blur in a way I can't quite believe. I went back to my apartment in Columbus and sat in the middle of it, not knowing what to do with my hands. I had spent 4 years learning how to function in times of crisis, how to handle hospital discharge papers and medication schedules, and how to talk to hospice nurses at 2 in the morning. There was no crisis to handle now. There was just a quiet apartment and a phone that Diane wasn't answering. I missed 2 freelance deadlines, then a third. Clients were patient at first, the way people are when they know someone has lost a parent. Then they couldn't be patient anymore. In September, I lost the Hendricks account, and in October, the Brower Group contract. I kept telling myself that if things calmed down, if I could get some sleep, if I could figure out what had really happened to my life, I would be okay. That moment of calm never came. My landlord didn't seem to mind, but somehow that made things worse. He gave me an extra 30 days and helped me load the boxes into my car. I thanked him, put all my belongings in the back seat of the car, and left the building where I had lived for 11 years. I was 41, sleeping on my girlfriend Priya's couch, and I had no idea what to do next. Priya saw it first. She was scrolling through real estate listings the way people do on slow evenings, and she went quiet in a way that made me look over. The family home on Sycamore Ridge Drive, 4 bedrooms, and the maple tree in the backyard that my father had planted the year I was born. Listed September 2nd. Sold September 19th. 17 days. The listing photos showed it staged with furniture I didn't recognize. The walls repainted a neutral gray that erased every version of the rooms I'd known. I don't remember what I said. I remember my sweetheart's face. Diane had sold it less than 8 weeks after my mother's burial. I started doing some research quietly, because I still didn't have the money to hire a lawyer, and someone on the grief support forum introduced me to a woman named Renata, who was a paralegal and an expert in will disputes. She wasn't cheap, but she offered an initial consultation for a set fee, and I drove to her office in a strip mall off Route 315 with a folder of some documents I had photocopied from Harlan's office before leaving. Renata had a kind of stillness that comes from years of reading documents that others have argued over. She unfolded the will's appendix on her desk and said nothing for a long time. Then she reached into her drawer, pulled out a magnifying glass, and leaned over the notary's block. "When did your mother's handwriting start to deteriorate?" he asked. I told him. "Sometime in late spring," I said. "April, maybe March." By May, she could barely sign a birthday card. Renata put down the magnifying glass. "The ink on the property annex and the ink on the notary stamp are of different ages." She kept her voice careful and steady. "They're supposed to match, but they don't. I've seen it before." The room went completely silent. "That doesn't prove anything by itself," she said, "but it's enough to file a lawsuit. It's enough to file a formal objection." She looked at me from across the desk. "Someone made a mistake or they got arrogant. Either way, there's a connection." I hadn't felt any work for months. I pulled the folder toward me and asked her where we should start. We started with a handwriting expert named Dr. Felicia Aucaffer, a forensic document examiner in Columbus who had testified in 3 will fraud cases in the past 5 years. Renata knew her. More importantly, the court knew her. Dr. Aucaffer charged $400,000 for a full analysis and written report, and I paid it without a second thought, which surprised me. 6 months ago, I might have been very concerned about this amount, but I had compared everything to my parents' expenses over the past 4 years, and $400,000 didn't seem like much. Dr. Aucaffer asked for some samples for comparison. The documents my mother had signed before she refused and the documents she had signed after. I had them. I had everything. Birthday cards from years past, mortgage refinancing paperwork from 2017, and 2 revised insurance forms from the spring of 2022, when my mother's hands were already shaking. I had put it all in a banker's box in the hallway closet because I was the one who organized things, knew where everything was, and was everywhere. 3 weeks later, the report arrived. 11 pages. I sat at the kitchen table and read the report where I had fed my mother oatmeal every morning for almost a year. Dr. Aucaffer's decision was unequivocal. The signature on the appendix of the document was inconsistent with my mother's usual writing style in every measurable way. The pressure of the pen, the spacing of the letters, and the special curve under the lowercase g. The signature had more of the characteristics of carefully practiced imitation than of natural decay. Dr. Aucaffer noted in a separate paragraph that the notary stamp had a batch code that related to a supply order placed 2 years after the stated execution date. No one had just forged it. They had used the wrong notary stamp. Arrogance, as Renata put it, or panic. Maybe both. Renata had filed the objection on Tuesday. By Thursday, Diane had hired another lawyer. The calls started coming in on Friday. Not from Diane, she never called me directly again. From her lawyer to Renata, whose tone oscillated from confident to cautious to trying to handle the situation. Renata told me each conversation in the same restrained tone she used for everything, but I learned to read the pauses in her words. When she said, "They expressed an interest in discussing terms," I knew that Diane knew very well what criminal charges meant. 6 weeks later, we settled. I got the house, the accounts, and everything in the original will. Diane was cleared of the fraud charge that would have come back to haunt her in every professional license application she filed. I sat at Renata's conference table one gray afternoon in March and signed the settlement agreement. My hand was steady. I noticed it and made a mental note of it. What I hadn't expected, what no one prepares you for, was that winning doesn't settle anything. It just hands you the bill. The bill for the documents you didn't notarize, the conversations you didn't record, and the moments you thought were enough sacrifice and didn't feel the need to write them down. I had given 4 years of my life to that house and those people, and in the end, the only reason anything of it survived was an ink batch code and a forensic examiner's magnifying glass. My mother never knew what Diane did. That's what I decided to believe. I can still smell her in the house, that special cedar and bergamot scent of her hand lotion, if I can smell it just as I open the door. Sometimes I stand just inside the doorway, allowing myself to savor the sensation for a moment before the rest of the scent returns.